But I really want to tell you how excited I am today because of our guest speaker. When I got started in this business, I am a mother and I have 4 kids, and these products changed my family and especially my youngest son. And I was so curious about what was going on with him that I was following the events of Zinzino, and the speaker was one of the speakers there. And I waited in line to talk to him because I really was excited to hear how come this was making effect on my son. And what he said just opened my eyes to how important this was, not just the changes in my own family and my own son, but for everybody out there. And so it has become a passion of mine to spread this to everybody who can listen to this, of what Zinzino is really about. So today we're going to bring that speaker on, who I met that day. And I actually can say I feel he is a good friend of mine now, because we have a lot of contact in really making this difference around the world. So I'd like to welcome, he's a scientific advisory board leader in Zinzino, but he's also been working his entire life around the world doing things because of his passion of making a difference in people's health. Because as he says, and what the topic for today is, we're going to talk about the diseases of uncivilization. So maybe we will hear it from himself, what he means with that. A big welcome to Dr. Paul Clayton. Hello, Dr. Paul. Welcome. I'm going to have you unmute there. There we go. Thank you. Hello, Dr. Paul. Welcome.
I'm so sorry I was a little late. A computer glitch.
It's all okay. So, Dr. Paul, you know, I have been learning so much for you in the 10 years that I've been involved in Zinzino. And as you know, so many people are aware of the world as it is today, but what are these diseases? A lot of people hear maybe the civilization. What are diseases of uncivilization? Could you explain that to us?
Well, just take a look around the world today. I mean, I see very little sign of civilization anywhere. My thesis would be that we were actually more civilized a century ago. However, what I'm talking about are the diseases that are so important at the public health level, and which have touched, I think, so many of the people who are sitting in on this talk. I think we all know someone, maybe close to us, maybe not so close, who has suffered from or is suffering from a non-communicable degenerative disease. And, you know, we can go through the list. You probably know what they mostly are, but the major problems are cardiovascular and cerebrovascular and cancer, with neurodegenerative coming up on the rails. They're becoming really, really important. Liver disease, non-alcohol related liver disease is actually also in that group of that leading group, but it's not talked about so much. But in fact, it involves about 1 in 4 of the world's population now. It's one of those things that has really escaped people's attention. And another condition, which is not so well known, but again, it's in that leading group of causes of ill health and premature death, is this combination of sarcopenia and met-obesity. And by that, I mean a pattern that is all too familiar with so many of us. As we get older, we grow heavier, but at the same time, we lose skeletal muscle, and that creates all kinds of metabolic problems. So these are making us really, really unwell at the public health level. And it turns out that although we used to think that was simply part and parcel of growing old, we now know that they're not. We now know that they're caused in intimate detail by the foods that we eat and the way in which we live. And I think that as this conversation goes on between Carla and myself, we'll have the opportunity to talk about what is the evidence for that outrageous statement that I've just made, and what, if anything, we could do about it. So let me just bounce the ball back into your side of the court, Carla, and tell me where you want to take this.
Well, first of all, I think that's really an important thing, because you just said that all these things are not part of the getting old process. I mean, I can say, I hear that all the time. People are saying, well, they're having trouble moving, or they're having trouble doing things. And they say, well, I'm getting old. You hear people saying that all the time. But what you're saying, Dr. Paul, is a lot of these things, it's not normal. We have to change maybe our thoughts of that. What we're talking about of getting old is not normal.
No, absolutely. It is normal. Now, and people can't see that unless you really dig into the data and do your research, because it is normal in our culture. It is normal. We see people as they get older, they become insulin resistant, they develop hypertension, they become forgetful, the joints get creaky. We think that's all normal, but it isn't. And we know this for 3 or 4 different areas. We know this, for example, from our study of cultures past. For example, the mid-Victorian period, which is 1850 to 1900 in England, a period and a place, an island in time, if you will, that is extremely beautifully documented. And in fact, I was one of the people who discovered it, but other people have taken up the running now. And we found a population that lived as long as we do, maybe a little bit longer. But more importantly, they were healthier for far longer. Because our lifestyle is really so bad for us, we start to become ill typically with symptoms in about the 6th decade of life. And we become progressively iller, more dependent. We lose more and more degrees of freedom until we die. We spend the last 10% of our lives becoming slowly, progressively more ill. And then what we find is, if we look at people who are younger than that, and we analyze them in detail, we find that they already have these diseases, but in very early pre-symptomatic form. So in people in their 50s, in their 40s, in their 30s, we are already finding the signs of developing coronary artery disease, developing arthritis, develop age-related cognitive decline, which moves towards, the dementias. These are all the signs of a population that is actually being chronically poisoned. Now, you go back to the mid-Victorian era, and what we see there is a population who didn't age in the way that we do. So they were extraordinarily physically healthy and robust. They were far healthier than we are, far stronger than we are, more resilient. And they retained their phenomenally good health. And, physical, mental, sexual, behavioral, everything. They had the whole package until typically the last few weeks, in some cases days, before they died. So they lived for far longer than we do. The proportion of their lives that they were healthy was probably close to 95, 96, 97%. Whereas for us, we spend the last 20 to 25% of our lives becoming progressively sicker. Mm-hmm. So that mid-Victorian experience, and it's really intensively documented, tells us the way we're living today is not right. The way we're becoming sick today is not right. The way that we're dying is not right. It's not natural.
But haven't we been told that we're living longer now?
No, we're not. We're not. That's just basic faulty epidemiology. If you go back to the mid-Victorian era, it looks, when you first look at the population size, that their life expectancy was, like 55, much younger than us. But that's only because they had really high childhood mortality. Because there's a lot of, infection, a lot of food-based, food poisoning. They were drinking water that was very often seriously contaminated. And so 1 in 4 children die before the age of 5. And that brings down the life expectancy for the whole population down, until it looks as if they're living really short lives. So what we did something a little bit more sophisticated than that. And this is a technique that is used by modern epidemiologists. What you do is you take those children out of the equation and you measure life expectancy from the age of 5. And when you do that, from that population, you see that at the age of 5, at the age of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, their chances of living so many years matched ours, in some cases exceeded them, but they were far healthier than we are for far longer.
So I have a question on this, because now I left the United States. I grew up in Minnesota, and I went to Denmark for about 30 years. And knew of, when I came back and started talking to people about Zinzino and asking them, I was shocked at the changes in the 30 years that I had been gone. Dr. Paul, I would talk to friends and family, and, when I had left back in the 80s, there was nobody that had children's diabetes. Nowadays, people are young getting that. I've had people talk about their kids and the arthritis that they have. There were so many diseases that are now being diagnosed, and they're talking about all of these things that are, issues, like, kids that are having struggles in school and can't sit still and do all these things. And there's so many epidemics going on. So are you saying that these things, it's not like I've heard people say, well, we're just diagnosing them now. Maybe they weren't diagnosed back then. But what you're saying is all of these tendencies are wrong. We don't need to be having all of these issues in our lives. We should be able to have healthy lives just like the Victorians did for longer and get more life in our years.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just the Victorians who give us that data. I mean, you're absolutely right when you say that back in the 80s, Danish public health was better. It was way better. Childhood obesity, childhood diabetes, type 2 diabetes hardly existed. Now, I went to medical school I first went there in 1968. And we were taught that, for example, diabetes, we were taught then was a disease of old age. And it was. We never saw diabetic patients. I mean, maybe the youngest might be in their mid-60s. And now we're seeing diabetic teens and even preteens. And once you're diabetic, you've lost 6 to 8 years of life expectancy. And your risk of a whole range of serious healthcare problems spirals once you've moved into diabetes. And it doesn't matter what anti-diabetic drugs you're taking. They don't change the situation. But there's other examples of this.
Whether it's heart issues or like all of these things that we're talking about, aging and what we used to call aging, it's because we're being, and you said a strong word with it, you called it being poisoned. What do you mean by that?
The term I usually use is chronic intoxication, which is more classically a scientifically correct terminology. But the lay parlance is poisoned. Yes, we are being poisoned. But I want to give you a few more examples of how much better things used to be in living memory, my memory, because I'm a pretty ancient specimen now, but I remember how public health was in the 60s. And I remember being taught at medical school that the lifetime risk of breast cancer in women was 1 in 33. And it was back in the 60s. Now it's approximately 1 in 6 to 7 to 8 in different parts of the world. We've become much more vulnerable to cancer. The numbers of childhood cancers has doubled, at least, in frequency since 1950. And some cancers, such as cancer of the bowel in fairly young people, has increased 4-fold. So these are all signs. They're all feathers in the same wind, or leaves in the same wind. They're all telling us, hey, you're living a really unhealthy lifestyle. You're being poisoned. Asthma now is extremely common. A typical classroom will have maybe 2 to 4 children who've got inhalers. A typical classroom. When I went to school in 1955, it was a very large school of 2,000 people. There was 1 boy with asthma in that whole school. So because this change has been so gradual, it's occurred over a period of decades, which really, if you look at our history, is just a blink of an eye. But it's happened too slowly for most doctors, most of whom are profoundly ahistoric. They have no understanding of history or the history of medicine whatsoever. All they see is the problem that is outside their doors right now. They see the tidal waves of patients washing into their surgeries every day, and they just try and treat them with the only thing they know, which is drugs, pharmaceuticals, because the pharmaceutical industry has more or less captured the medical profession and dominates medical schools, training systems to an unhealthy degree. So all of these things are going on, and the doctors have really lost the point. They've lost track of the main problem, which is there are far more people getting sick now because of diet and lifestyle. All we're doing with drugs is treating symptoms. We should be going to look at the roots of the problem and trying to put out the fires instead of trying to catch sparks, which is what most of the medical system consists of now. Now, I think, as I scrolled through some of the pictures, I think I saw of someone online who looked like a doctor. I think he was wearing medical scrubs. And so I'm really happy. I spent a lot of time talking to my peers and clinicians and clinical scientists, and that gentleman may want to put up his hand and engage in a discussion about some of these points, and I would be happy to do so. But most doctors, I think, have lost the plot. I think that we are recapitulating a situation that goes back to London in the 18th century and early 19th century, when you had a man called John Snow. This was the father of epidemiology, and he's really famous in all the medical textbooks because this was a time when London was having fairly frequent outbreaks of infections that we now know are waterborne, so typhoid, typhus, cholera. And there was an epidemic, I think, of typhoid, which was due to pollution in the water system. They didn't have any schemes of public sanitation. And so the human excreta were being washed into the river, and people were drinking from that same river. There was no water treatment. And there was one particularly bad outbreak in one one area of town, which is quite close to where John Snow's practice was. And all the other doctors of the day were prancing around, wearing, those beaks that those medieval quacks used to wear. And they were bleeding and purging their patients and killing them in large numbers, just as doctors do today. But what John Snow did, he sat back and said, wait a minute, I think there's a pattern here. And he got a map of London and he pinpointed all of the cases of infection. And he was able to work out that all these people were drawing water from one particular well. And through a gigantic leap of intellect, a superb example of inferential reasoning, he thought, oh, it must be the pump. And if so, that was his hypothesis. If this hypothesis is correct, blocking that well is going to stop the outbreak of illness. And he talked to some of his other doctor friends, and they said, you're mad. And they just went around offering people splinters of the true cross, bones of the saints, that kind of crap, pharmaceuticals of the day. But what John Snow did, he went down to the well in the middle of the night, took the handle off the pump so it was no longer operative. Within 2 days, the epidemic was over. Mm-hmm. And that's where we are now. Doctors are still running around bleeding and purging in a only marginally more sophisticated way than their medical ancestors used to do. What we have to do is take the handle off the pump, address the source of the problems, which is today's incredibly degraded diet, what we call the post-transitional diet. And we can go into that in more detail if you want.
So we're looking at, we can look and see, okay, we're pinpointing all the areas of the world that they are having the most issues. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to look at that in the same way as John Snow did, we can actually pinpoint there are different areas around that they're healthier. And you said you were studying them.
Yep.
And then there's the parts of the world that have the epidemic going on. And I know the US is definitely one of them. So what are we pinpointing here? What are we looking for in regards to people's health? I mean, people don't realize, I think, Dr. Paul, so many people, when they're saying, well, this is just part of getting older, I'm getting old, they just don't know. They don't know that this is not normal. So
it really isn't normal. It really isn't normal. If you know how to take very basic precautions, the entire aging process can be dramatically modified.
So where are we seeing these things? Where are we looking? What are the places that are doing good, and what are the places that are bad, and what are they doing differently?
So let's try and parse this whole problem through the eyes of John Snow. Well, how would he look at this if he were alive today? Well, I think the first thing he would do is he would look at national databases, looking at life expectancy and patterns of disease. And what he would find is that the non-communicable chronic degenerative diseases, the ones that I listed at the beginning, have their highest frequency in North America, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, and in a strip of Western Europe. And there's pockets elsewhere, which we don't have to go into all of them. That's the general pattern. And it just so happens that these are the nations which have the highest intake of ultra-processed foods. And this has given rise to this idea of what has been known as the nutrition transition, which was first coined by one of the great scientists working in this area, Barry Popkin, who is now an advisor to all of the global institutions who are looking at these problems. And by nutrition transition, what he meant was what has happened in every country which has left its traditional diet behind and moved over to modern ultra-processed or industrial food or fodder. Every country that has done this has seen a catastrophic decline in health expectancy, which is so bad that it is now coming to the surface as reduced life expectancy. Life expectancy is falling in all the countries that have over-enthusiastically embraced these ultra-processed foods. And we know that the more of these foods you eat, the more you are likely to develop heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, cancer, and indeed to die prematurely. This is no longer a matter of doubt and debate. The case is cut and dried. It's been made, it's really been proven. And what I've been looking at is this question, well, how is it that this ultra-processed diet is killing us? But before we get into the machinery, let's go back to John Snow, and I've outlined some of the areas which have the worst health. Let's look at some of the areas which have the best health. We can't go back to the 19th century England. So which are the parts of the world now that have the best health, and what are they eating? Well, we call them the blue zones. There's Ikaria, which is a Greek island. There's Sardinia. Both of these are in the Mediterranean. You have the Mount Athos monastery, which is also in Greece. You have Campo de Meli and similar hill villages in the Apennines. That's up and down the backbone of Italy. You've got Okinawa. You have the Loma Linda community in California, which is rather atypical. And you have the Kuna Islanders. And one thing all of these cultures have in common is they don't eat ultra-processed foods. They eat the traditional basic diet. And they are so much healthier than we are. There's another couple of groups, cultural groups, which I find very interesting. They are the hunter-gatherer Hadza in Tanzania and the forager horticulturalist Tsimane in Bolivia. And they've been very intensively studied by biological anthropologists. And one of them is a guy called Michael Gervin, who's at the University of California in Los Angeles. And he has been looking at them, looking at what they eat, looking at how they live. And it just turns out that these cultures, people who live the old-fashioned way, don't age in the way that we do. As they get older, they don't develop essential hypertension. Their joints do not get creaky. The kidneys do not lose the ability to secrete concentrated urine. Ours do, which is why old people like me, if they don't know how to look after themselves, get dehydrated so quickly. In males, the prostate does not get older, get larger as they get older. They can't develop insulin resistance. The hippocampus, which is a part of the brain, doesn't deteriorate with age as ours do. And that means that they're almost immune to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. They just don't have all these problems that we do. And from these lines of evidence, we are forced to the conclusion that most of the signs of aging are in fact signs of a terribly unhealthy lifestyle or chronic intoxication, long-term poisoning.
So these blue zones is kind of like going back in time to when I was, back in the 80s when I was living in the United States. Back in time, 50, 60, 70 years ago, before we really had all the processed foods. So if this is stuff that they know, Dr. Paul, and when we hear it from you, it's like, well, of course, it sounds like factual. It's not following through. If this is the science that tells us that we need to, we got to get rid of this type of thing. And I think people are starting to be more aware of things. We hear of people saying, do this diet. And in essence, a lot of them are kind of saying the same thing. Stay away from processed foods, eat more whole foods.
Well, can we just differentiate between processed and ultra-processed?
Yeah.
Okay, there's a difference. it's important. Processed foods, when you've got basic produce, which could be a cabbage, it could be a joint of beef, it could be a glass of milk. Processing, it could be butter or bread or cheese. You see there, you've taken your basics and you've done something to them, but you know what's in there. You can see it and recognize it for what it is. Ultra processed tends to be those types of foods which have been made by the large multinational food manufacturing companies. They will typically, it's just a rule of thumb, will contain 6 or more ingredients. They tend to have a long shelf life. They tend to contain stabilizers, emulsifiers, acidulants, and all those sort of weird, sort of chemically sounding names. And they tend to taste really delicious. And the reason for that is that the same companies who make these rather toxic products spend a lot of time and trouble fine-tuning the taste, the aroma, and the mouthfeel to make them very, very attractive. They're designed to be almost addictive. And they're designed in a specific way, which we can talk about if you want. And they're very hard to resist. And children, once they've been introduced to them, want more. And the eating habits you pick up as a child, you tend to take through into middle age and older age. So there's no evil genius behind the curtain who's deliberately trying to poison us. The food companies are just trying to create addicts who'll buy their products again and again. They just want to make money. We go along with that because they give us what we like to eat, and the products are everywhere in all the stores. They're cheap because they're artificially subsidized, and so we eat them. And the pharmaceuticals industry says, thank you very much, because when we eat these kinds of foods, we get all these long-term diseases that make us cash cows for the pharmaceutical industry. So this is a very unhealthy holding pattern.
But if there is something in our food, if there's a dye that's the wrong color and causing cancers, there are things out there, the protection people out there that are telling us you can't have this. You're dying from this. This is unhealthy. So there are certain things that are taken away. Why are our all the institutions that are saying, protecting us, not saying we can't do this? Because if it's long term, we're getting sick. People are dying from all those diseases you said. Those are like the main things people are dying from.
Well, things like some of the first generation of food dyes, which we actually now we discovered were quite toxic, but you can identify that. You can test out in a preclinical model. And once you've established that something is dangerous, you can say, oh, we got that wrong, we better get rid of it. Now, the problem is not so much what's in the food supply, it's what's been removed. And that is much more difficult to test for. What the multinational food companies have done, and the large national companies, I don't want to let them off the hook, is they've created a diet which is very, very low in the long-chain omega-3s, and the polyphenols, in prebiotic fibers, and in 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans. The 4 most important anti-inflammatory compounds have been removed from the diet for different reasons. And because of the way in which foods are manufactured in large amounts at high speeds using very high temperatures, the foods have been adulterated, if you like, by the production process itself with significant amounts of other compounds, age, AL, LPS compounds, which are highly pro-inflammatory. So now you have a diet which is all the important protective anti-inflammatory compounds have gone. They've been replaced by 3 really important pro-inflammatory compounds. And that is one of the ways in which the modern diet makes us sick. It creates chronic inflammatory stress. And that is one of the mechanisms whereby the modern diet and lifestyle makes us so very ill. But there's 3 others. That's just 1 in 4. One of the other problems with these ultra-processed foods is they contain enormous amounts of empty calories. Lots of sugars, simple starches, and plant oils. And these really have no nutritional value whatsoever. We are getting by in about 2,000 kilocalories a day, especially if we're white collar or live and work in cities. And if a third or a quarter of those are empty calories, you're eating actually very small amounts of unnecessarily low levels of the types of foods which give you the nutritional components you need. So we end up with a pattern of malnutrition called type B malnutrition, where on the surface you look as if you're getting enough calories, maybe too many, but inside, when we look at what's on the plate, what's inside you, what we find is that most people are depleted in a lot of the vitamins, you call them vitamins, trace elements, phytonutrients, and a whole range of other compounds. So that works together with chronic inflammatory stress. It leads to a progressive loss of the extracellular matrix, amongst other things, leading to the progressive destruction of healthy tissue. And that's one of the hallmarks, it's one of the core elements of the non-communicable degenerative diseases. So that's two ways in which the modern diet makes us sick. There's two more, which we can go into later if you want.
Well, let's just start with the first two. So you said the first one is the omega balance, because they're taking out the omega-3s of things and adding in a lot of the plant-based things, which is more omega-6. And that's creating, it's more of an inflammation. It's a pro-inflammatory state.
Highly pro-inflammatory, but it's exacerbated by the fact that our polyphenol intakes have gone down, and the prebiotic fibers and the 1,2,1,6 beta-glucans, they've all gone for different reasons. So your four major anti-inflammatory compounds have gone. And what we have found is that you can redress this, you can reverse this, and dampen chronic inflammatory stress in almost every tissue in the body by putting back into your diet this combination of long-chain omega-3s and a very peculiar set of polyphenols that are called amphiphiles. When you do that, inflammatory stress generally switches off. It takes a while. It takes about 2 to 4 months, but it switches it off very effectively. Okay,
so everybody has heard about inflammation in the last few years. You hear it's the start of everything. It's like 95% of everything starts because of all this inflammation in the body.
I wouldn't go there. I don't think that's 95%. There are four major mechanisms.
Okay.
Chronic inflammatory stress is one of them.
So talking about the first one, you're saying we can actually turn that off?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Explain what you're doing to turn it off.
Well, the inflammatory sequence, not just inside the cells, which is very interesting, but it's really rather esoteric, but outside the cells, which is where things really start to go very badly wrong. It's a multi-step process, and the omega-6 to 3 ratio is critical at the front end of this process, and at the back end of the process, your levels of, or intakes of certain types of polyphenols are really, really important. Now, the modern diet gets the 6-3 ratio wrong, takes the polyphenols away, and you've got this inflammatory sequence roaring away constantly at full blast, leading to the progressive loss of bone or cartilage or your artery walls or your brain cells or whatever it happens to be. And also, by the way, driving cancer. And what we're trying to do is to stop that, and we do that by combining these omega-3s with the right amphiphilic polyphenols, which is the same combination you find in eating oily fish, mackerel, herring, salmon, those sorts of things.
Okay. So you're getting that omega-6-3 balance taken care of and adding all of those things that you need to the diet to turn off the anti-inflammation there first. Now,
Yeah.
You said the next thing in regards to the gut. Explain that a little.
Well, what has happened since about 1950, but to some extent before that, but after 1950 in particular, we move into the post-war scenario. We may be just about to go into the next one, but what has happened since 1945, as the food industry became more mechanical, as our diet became more industrial, as we moved from real food to fodder, what we have seen for various reasons is a progressive removal of these prebiotic fibers from the diet. And that has led very directly to dysbiosis in the gut. Now, everybody thinks that the microbiome is in the gut. Well, a large part of it is, but we also have a very different microbiota on the skin. We have a different microbiota in the blood, in the brain, in the joints. There are bugs everywhere. There is no compartment in the body which is sterile. But the important one for purposes of our discussion is the one in the large bowel. Once you take the prebiotic fibers away, the bacteria that we like, the ones that like us, start to starve to death, and they decline dramatically in numbers. And that's a shame, because if you have the right bugs and you're feeding them those fibers, They produce compounds which are very anti-inflammatory and which are also very good at killing cancer cells. So if you have those bacteria in the gut, you're not going to have IBS, IBD, colorectal cancer. Those things are going to be really, really rare. Take the prebiotic fibers away. The good bacteria disappear. They're replaced by a different form, different type. Instead of gram-positive, they're gram-negative. And these gram-negative bacteria don't eat the prebiotic fibers. They are designed to eat proteins, proteolytic. So what they do is they eat away at the mucosal layer that lies over the epithelium of the gut, the lining of the colon, and they come into direct contact with our cells, the cells that line the colon, and create serious, huge inflammation.
So I've heard so many people talk about, you're talking about prebiotics. I hear a lot of people talk about probiotics.
Well, the probiotics aren't particularly effective because, no matter what you're taking very small numbers compared to the vast, almost astronomical numbers of bacteria that live in the gut. If you want to change that whole internal environment, you have to send in the right fuel, which are these prebiotic fibers. If you do that, you can increase the numbers of the good bacteria by 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude. And as they grow, they get rid of the bad guys. So then the balance flips back to being gram-positive, anti-inflammatory, chemoprotective. And I think I said really early on, since 1950, the frequency of bowel cancer in young people has increased. Actually, no, not since 1950. That's more recently. In the last 25 years, the frequency of bowel cancer in young people has increased 4 times. 4 times.
Oh,
so what we
let's check on these. We talked about 4 things, so we talked about some of them. Let's make sure we get all of them.
Okay. Well, 1 was chronic inflammation. 2 is this malnutrition. 3 is dysbiosis, and the 4th one is something that we can refer to as, I hate the jargon, sorry about this, it's scientific shorthand, glycemic mismatch. And what this refers to is the fact that we're pouring too much glucose into the bloodstream because we're eating tons of sugar. It's in all these ultra-processed foods and starch. And the processes that we would normally use to remove that glucose from the bloodstream, which is not the liver at all. The liver is very limited capacity. The major sink for glucose is skeletal muscle. And that's where insulin is mostly working. But here's the problem. We're so physically inactive these days that our skeletal muscle is not working as a glucose sink as well as it did a generation, or nearly as well as it did 2 or 3 generations ago. And you see the results everywhere. This is the reason why we are drowning in diabetes. And once you're diabetic, the risk of all these long-term complications come in, including cancers and neurodegenerative diseases and blindness and neuropathy and kidney failure and liver disease. So it's these 4 things, these 4 mechanisms: inflammation, type B malnutrition, dysbiosis, and glycemic mismatch. They are responsible for about 90% of all the disease that we see today. And that's what drives aging as we know it.
Okay, so those things are why all of this, that's the uncivilization, and that's what we're doing, and that's why we're having all these aging issues.
And how uncivilized are we that we've allowed this situation to develop, that we have allowed the multinational food companies to get away with this? That's pretty uncivilized.
Okay, so now we know, and we get a little bit irritated by it and say, okay, we don't want to have these things that are just normal for getting older. Now, I've been on Zinzino for 10 years, and Dr. Paul, I know I am feeling 10 years younger instead of 10 years older. So let's talk now about what we're doing about it. We can say this is what we have, but what can we do about it? And I know that's what you're passionate about also.
My advice would be to anyone who's looking for a healthier lifestyle is sell your flat, your apartment, your condo. Go out and find a tract in the wilderness. Dig out a small garden. Grow your own food. Hunt, shoot, fish. Get the sun on your back and the dirt under your nails. And live a pre-transitional lifestyle. Honestly, that's the best thing to do. Now, I accept we can't all do that.
Okay,
Okay.
but it's good advice. I think it's great. It's just not something everybody can do, Dr. Paul.
Well, I would be happy to do it, providing I had internet in my little log cabin. Then I'd be fine. But I think that
Are there other options?
yeah, there are hacks. There are hacks. There are other ways of doing it, which frankly are my second choice. But there are hacks, so let's quickly go through them. You can stop chronic inflammatory stress with balance oil. See, that's how we designed the health protocol. First of all, it was 10 or 15 years of research to try and distill these diseases of civilization into the machinery, this simple machinery, these 4 different problems. Once you know what the problems are, you can develop antidotes to them. And that's what the health protocol is. So chronic inflammation, we can neutralize with balance oil. The malnutrition, the type B malnutrition, we can neutralize that with Extend. That's what it's designed to do. The dysbiosis.
Because there's people on here that are saying, what? Balance oil. So this is why you have, because of the diseases of uncivilization, you're saying if we're going to target them and we're going to really make a difference, that's why you have been working so hard on this Zinzino's health protocol to work on these 4 things.
Well, the idea was that we create a blue zone of our own. We would reestablish pre-transitional nutrition and therefore metabolism and therefore disease risk. And Zinzino gave me the opportunity to take those ideas and distill them into actually a set of simple tools that everybody could use if they wanted to.
And so now you talk about this balance oil, and I know that is getting rid of the first thing. So by putting back in the polyphenols and the omega-3, you're actually putting the things back into the diet that we had years ago.
We're putting the damping elements back into the nuclear reactor. We're slowing everything down and we're saying, hey, stop, don't have chronic inflammation anymore. I mean, you need to be able to have a degree of inflammation if you're invaded by a bacterium or a virus, or if you've been injured. Inflammation, acute inflammation, is absolutely necessary. It's part of your defense system. But if you're eating the post-transitional, the modern ultra-processed diet, you have inflammation all the time. We call that chronic inflammation. We need to switch that off. And we do that very effectively with this combination of long-chain omega-3, highly unsaturated fatty acids, and these amphiphile polyphenols. Now that sounds like fish oil. It's not. Fish oil doesn't work. Not just me saying that. That's the Cochrane collaboration, the good and the great all over the world, who do these vast meta-analyses. They hoover up all the clinical trials that have been done with fish oil. And there's several hundreds of them now. And they say, well, okay, we've got 60 studies in cardiovascular disease. Let's add them all up. What's the endpoint? Fish oil has no effect. There are a whole bunch of studies on retinal degeneration, on Alzheimer's, on osteoporosis. And it doesn't matter which endpoint you look at, fish oil doesn't work. And that's really odd. Really odd, because if you look at those little parts of the world where people eat large amounts of oily fish, they don't have chronic inflammation and they don't get sick in that way, not to anything like the same extent. And so there was this huge question in our minds: why is fish oil so useless, and why is oily fish so protected? And it turns out that the oily fish contains more than just fish oil. It's not just omega-3s. It's another component as well, which is really critical. And those are these amphiphile polyphenols. You always find them in nature, wherever you find the omega-3s. So all we did was recombine them. And what that means is that when you drink balance oil, it's like drinking a liquid fish.
Aha, that really makes sense, Dr. Paul. Okay, so we can get rid of the first one there. Now we're coming to the malnutrition, and that's where you're putting back the vitamins, the minerals, and everything in there that we need. So this is just, is it like a multivitamin?
Well, sort of. I mean, you can think of it as a multi-story building. The multivitamin, the standard A to Z is the ground floor, and you need those things. But on their own, they're not enough. On top of that, we add a second floor, which is this very complex combination of tocopherols and tocotrienols. These are all the 8 different forms of vitamin E, and they all the different forms have slightly different effects in the body. You need all of them, really. And then on top of that, we've added a rogues gallery of phytonutrients. So the carotenoids are in there, the xanthophylls are in there, and a few other things besides, including beta carotene, which is something that not many people know about, but is really important. Then on top of that, we've added 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans, which improve the functioning of the cellular components of your innate immune system. You know, the macrophages, neutrophils, natural killer cells, CD8 cells, things like that. Langerhans and Kupffer cells, and I'm saying all this for the benefit of the doctor, I think, is lurking in the background because he knows what they are, even if most other people don't. And then we've also added into this this blend, this bewitching blend, just a hint, a pinch of cyanide. When I say cyanide, I don't mean, you know, the bottle with the skull and crossbones, but it's a compound that forms cyanogenic compounds in the body. And it turns out, this has not been very well known until recently, that a very small amount of this is actually essential. People think of it as a poison. It is if you eat too much, but almost everything is if you eat too much of it, including sugar and water. But a very small amount of these compounds are essential. You've heard of cyanocobalamin, which is one form of vitamin B12. But other compounds which use these groups are really, really important in the functionality of your innate immune system. So we've put a couple of things in here that improve the innate immune system's ability to ward off infection, whether it's bacterial or viral. And during this COVID nonsense that was going on, which was really just, we can look back at it now, and we know individuals who were really badly affected, but at the public health level, it was nothing. A disease which had a 99.72% survival rate, and where many of the people who supposedly died of COVID, in fact, died with COVID. This was a public health scare, not really a public health problem. But what we found is that in our Zinzino group, and we're up to close to 1 million now, I think we had 2 hospitalizations that I know of and no deaths. If your immune system is working well, you're not really going to have much of an issue with COVID or influenza or a whole range of other diseases either.
So by using this, you're also doing strengthening or boosting that.
Well, I don't like to talk about boosting the immune system, because then people think, oh, if I boost the immune system, do we have more autoimmune disease? Do we have more allergy? It doesn't work like that. We're simply restoring normal function, because these compounds used to be in the diet. They were always there until over the last 50 years, they were gradually removed. And that has made us incredibly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So we're simply putting back into the diet the things that were always there and restoring optimal function. That's all. Okay, so that was that. Now we had the dysbiosis. So there you did something actually different. And here we're back to those prebiotics. We did. And I think that if I did anything right, it was extend. And this is my stroke of genius, I think. And what it was is this very complex time-release blend of prebiotic fibers. Now, any microbiologist or biochemist, or indeed any doctor listening into this will think, well, what is a time-release blend of prebiotics? It works like this. These prebiotic fibers, if you take them in a bolus, that is in a single scoop or dose, they pass through the small intestine intact. They're not digested. That's the part of the definition of a prebiotic fiber. They are resistant to the digestive enzymes. This combination enters the large bowel intact. And if you're using different fiber lengths, that will then create fermentation, technically, in different parts of the gut. So the very short fibers, which ferment quite rapidly, will start to ferment in the ascending colon, and the progressively longer fibers will start to ferment further down the colon, moving into the transverse descending colon, and then right down to the rectum. And it's really important to get the right doses of each of these different fibers, because the very short fibers are broken down very quickly. And if you use those in large doses, you have enormous problems. You get into, bloating and diarrhea. It's really unpleasant. But you need a very small amount to start this changeover towards the good bacteria in the ascending colon, and then you're feeding that reaction as the blend passes through the colon. If you do it right, if you get it right, you can get a wholesale transformation of the microbiome all the way through the large bowel from gram-negative dominant to gram-positive dominant, and from pro-inflammatory and frankly carcinogenic to anti-inflammatory and chemoprotective. It involved a lot of number crunching. We had to look at fermentation rates. We had to look at colon transit times, and we had to look at therapeutic indices of the different fiber lengths. And I scribbled all this out on the first version on the back of an envelope, and then subsequently went into it in a lot more detail. And we put together this blend that is ZINOBIOTIC, which is really well tolerated because the bulk of it is the longer fibers. So oat, 1,3,1,4 beta glucans, green banana type resistant starch, but you've got just enough of the short chain fibers to start this process of flipping the microbiome right from the start of the large bowel, and then maintain it all the way through. When you do this, symptoms of IBS and after a while IBD start to fade away, and even more excitingly, the normal colonic mucosal epithelial barrier is restored. Endotoxemia recedes. And at that point, you're no longer really going to have much problems with your liver either. So this is really important, so important that the World Health Authority, whose reputation has been terribly degraded under its current leadership, but used to be a pretty good organization. They did a very, very excellent meta-analysis a couple of years back, and they worked out that if you weren't eating about 12 grams of prebiotic fibers a day, your risk of early, that means avoidable death, shot up by 30%. I mean, huge, huge. So we think we're taking that risk factor out of the equation with these prebiotic fibers.
Wow, that's exciting. Okay, so we've got those three. How about the fourth, which was the mismatch, that glycemic mismatch? So what are we doing for that?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of this you have to do. What you have to do is to stop eating so much sugar. You have to stop eating so much starch, because both of these types of foods will pour glucose into your bloodstream. And you have to start taking more regular physical exercise. And there's a whole bunch of studies that have been done in different parts of the world that show conclusively that if you do those things, if you have type 2 diabetes, you can reverse it. Metabolic syndrome is even easier to reverse. So type 2 diabetes is eminently curable if you take these basic steps. And for those people who can't take physical exercise, for example, they're paraplegic or hemiplegic, or they have diabetic neuropathy or things like that, there's a hack too. And we don't have that. I had developed one 3 years ago, but we couldn't release it because we're a multinational, and every country in the world said yes, apart from one, which was Denmark, your people, and the regulators there, who are not scientific at all and have their own views, which are quite irrational and are not in step with the regulators in any other country, said, oh, this is an alien or a foreign food. It's not, we can't regard this as a foodstuff, which you have to if you want to make it a supplement. So we were stymied. And I've recently come up with an alternative, and we're starting to examine that now. And this is a herbal extract, which has the same effect on the body as taking physical exercise. Now, for the scientists in the audience, the way it works is by phosphorylating and upregulating AMP kinase. And that leads to increased beta oxidation, increased expression of GLUT4 receptors on muscle, increased mitochondrial neogenesis, improvements in your TYG or TIG, if you want to be, if you notice that fasting blood glucose, everything starts to go back into the bottle, and that's something that I'm hoping we'll be able to bring into production and distribution by about the end of this year. Once we do that, we will have antidotes to each one of those 4 drivers of chronic degenerative disease. And at that point, if you do all of those things, you've gone back to the pre-transitional lifestyle. You've made your own blue zone, and you will then enjoy the health benefits that spin off from living in a blue zone.
I love this. That's exciting because I'm already feeling so much better, but we definitely, I mean, I wish I would have known about this 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Not too late. It's not too late.
and yeah, because now I can run around after these grandchildren that I have now, and I'm sure I'm going to have a lot more to come. So Dr. Paul, you said the number one thing you could do in regards to these diseases of uncivilization is to get rid of everything you have and plant a garden and live off of all of that. But the second best choice right now, that would be take the Zinzino health protocol. It is designed to work together against the diseases of civilization, and you are working to improve this on any time or any way that you can at all times.
Well, providing you're still alive, I think that there's an opportunity to make things better. The Greeks, and this is something I think about a lot, the Greeks have this saying, dum spiro spero, which means while I breathe, there's hope. And that really is the case. If you're well enough to be walking around and thinking and talking and engaging in a conversation like this, then there's a lot that can be salvaged, a huge amount.
So that means that the health protocol is actually because of the diseases of uncivilization, the way we're getting poisoned in our diet now. What we can do is to battle this. Let's get the word out and get everybody, and it's from any age and any time, as long as they haven't passed, there is help for this then, correct?
We can work miracles. I mean, really we can. We're seeing in our first prospective randomized clinical trial, a large percentage of the people that we're treating who had chronic degenerative diseases, they're becoming symptom-free and they're becoming pharmaceutically independent. They don't need their medication anymore. So we're helping the blind to see and the lame to walk. We try not to bring the dead back to life because it creates enormous administrative problems. So we tend not to go there.
I love your humor, Dr. Paul. It makes me laugh here. But I do know for me personally, it made a difference for my family, for myself, and it made such a difference for my son. I am so glad that I traveled to find you at one of the Zinzino events to stand in line. I knew I stood a long time just to get your word on that. And what you actually said was, that just makes sense. You're finally giving him some things that he can absorb now. So if it is something going on in his brain, you're giving him what his brain is made of. If you needed to repair a brick wall, you would use bricks, and you made it so simple. Well, and that's what you did today for everybody. Also, we're rebuilding it.
Okay, it's not quite like that. I mean, the brain isn't made of omega-3s. It's made of a large part of it is made of phosphatidyl phospholipids, which the omega-3s are built into. But yeah, the logic is somewhat like that. Now, what I'd really like to do before you close this down, I've seen a bunch of questions over on the right-hand side. I haven't had time to answer all of them. But if there's any medics or clinical scientists or people with a scientific background of any sort who have any questions or criticisms, at this point, I would love to hear them.
Okay. So what I will do is I do have some help on the line. So if there is somebody who has something, please mark if you are a health professional that would have a question on what Dr. Paul said, put your hand up for your question. And Dr. Paul, on the side here, there are a lot of things here of questions. Maybe you can take a look at them. And while you're doing that, I will mention that Dr. Paul does have a blog that you can read a lot of these things about on drpaulclayton.eu. So do that also. I don't know if you want to address some of the questions here, as I don't know how much time you have.
Sure.
We can take a little bit of time for your questions. People just love when they can ask you different questions. And
well, there's a couple of questions in the chat box which I think I can address. One of them from Fran, who asks, is it possible to take too many polyphenols? And the answer is yes, it definitely is. Some of these polyphenols, these are really very bioactive compounds, and they have an impact on many enzyme systems and many cellular and subcellular functions. And if you take really large amounts of polyphenols, I think that you run the risk of malabsorption scenarios. The polyphenols used to be known as anti-growth factors, because if you're eating lots of them, they will bind to various minerals in the gut, and you then cannot absorb them quite as well. That's one problem. There is also some evidence that if you really fantastically overdose, you may end up creating situations where you're starting to damage healthy cells, and we don't want to do that at all. Now, the nice thing about many of these natural compounds is because they're part of the foods that we co-evolved with, they were always part of our diet, we're pretty good at handling them. So the margins for error are very wide. The therapeutic index, that is the ratio between the dose that is healthy and the dose that will damage you, you're talking about many multiples. It's not like a pharmaceutical such as paracetamol, where simply taking between 6 or 8 times the regular dose could kill you. Same with aspirin. Or the blood thinners like coumarin. Now, the margins here are much greater, but if you're really determined and you really go at it, you could harm yourself by eating too much polyphenol. So I don't recommend that. And Fer says, is xenogene useful for any of these diseases? Xenogene is not really part of the healthcare protocol. It stands out on its own a little bit because once we had the protocol, I think that we were then able to say, okay, we can create this blue zone. We can dramatically reduce your chances of developing really all the diseases of uncivilization. But there is certain aspects of the aging process which are still going on. Can we address those as well? And this was really almost an academic exercise. And it's derived from a body of research which focuses on the accumulation of senescent cells as part of the aging process. And when a cell comes to the end of its lifespan, its useful life, what it is genetically programmed to do is to switch itself off, is to remove it from the equation, to kill itself. There's a programmed suicide called apoptosis. The cells die in lots of other ways as well. Ferroptosis is one I've been writing about recently, but apoptosis is probably more common. And in some cases, that program doesn't work properly. And so the cell lingers on, even though it's not working very well. That's what we call senescent. And if you accumulate too many of them, they secrete compounds known as the SASP, SASP, senescence-associated secretory profile. And this causes inflammation, it causes inflammatory stress. And that can actually exacerbate cancer. It can lead to accelerated breakdown of functioning healthy tissue. And it's an important part of the way in which tissues lose function over time. It's a large part of the aging process. So people have been looking at magic bullets that they could use, whether they're synthetic or natural, to remove these senescent cells, kill them off without harming healthy tissues. And there's a couple of pharmaceuticals that have been developed, which are useful in preclinical models. They're rather toxic. And then there's a group of natural compounds which do pretty much the same thing. There's an alkaloid from one of the pepper plants. There are a number of polyphenols. The curcuminoids are one that we looked at because we've got good delivery systems. Fisetin, which you find in the pagoda tree and strawberries. And then you have procyanidin C1, which is a grapeseed derivative, which is probably the best. And we use the curcuminoids to begin with because we have this very special delivery system, which gives you very high tissue levels at the levels where we know senolysis, that is the killing of senescent cells, takes place. I think that because we're using quite a high dose to achieve these effective levels, it looks as if we're going to run into regulatory problems. And I think we're going to have to take the version 1 of Xenogene off the market. We'll replace it with a new version where we're using rather lower amounts of procyanidin P1. And what we're trying to do, and what we found in animal models, I should have said, is that when you give these things to animals, you seem to reverse large parts of the aging process. They start to remember mazes again. They start to be able to be physically robust, and their stamina returns. They start looking younger, basically, if you kill off these senescent cells. And we think that we're going to see the same things in humans. And because these natural compounds we're working with are so safe, we thought, well, the data says we should be able to kill off some senescent cells. Let's try this. We're experimenting. It's an experiment, but a safe one. And then if the formulation has any merit at all, it's because I thought, well, we're removing senescent cells, should not try and replace them with new healthy functional cells. And that's where the fucoidines come in, or the fucoidines, depending on who you talk to. And they're anti-adhesin compounds. For the geeks, they're polysulfated oligosaccharides you get from seaweed. They make seaweed slippery, and they're like biological Teflon. And we know that if you eat these, they are able to dislodge some stem cells from their long sleep in the marrow of your long bones. So these stem cells will then get into the circulation. They are heat-seeking missiles that go to wherever the tissue damage is. And where a senescent cell has been removed, that stem cell will come into that place and repopulate that tissue with new, healthy, young cells. So that was the idea behind Xenogene. I frankly didn't know how effective it would be. We've had some phenomenal feedback. I mean, really amazing reports. But as I said, I rather think that we may have to pull our horns in and focus on Xenogene Mark II, which, with any luck, we should have available by the end of this year.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm loving that you are always working on making sure there's the next version, or if the science is showing something, we're doing what the, the best thing on the market. So cutting edge technology. So I'm going to just gather together a couple of the questions here.
Okay.
People are talking about maybe like a reaction if people are taking the health protocol, or if they're getting like this detox. Or one was Vivian asking in regards to a customer who's had just very gassy and been on a health protocol for a month, but it hasn't been helping yet. It does take time. So what is, is there issues with somebody if they can't take something, or?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. With Zinobiotic, for example, if you have small SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that's a situation where some of these rather nice probiotic species, the gram-positive bugs, have moved into the small intestine, where really they're not supposed to be. That can happen under certain situations. And if you then start to eat prebiotic fibers, these bacteria start to ferment them in the small intestine, and that's really very uncomfortable. The small intestine isn't designed to be able to cope with that. So people with SIBO will have a problem with Zinobiotic, with any prebiotic fibers at all. So it's important for them to dislodge those bacteria and flush them back down into the large bowel where they should be. There is an approach that the Germans have been using for generations to do this. It's part of their ethnobotanical database. In the same way that we use L-mannose to dislodge urinary tract pathogens, the Germans have used carrot oligosaccharides to do the same thing without knowing it. If you boil carrots into a soup until the carrot soup starts to taste faintly sweet, then that's telling you that the carrot starch is being hydrolyzed into much smaller molecular weight di- and trisaccharides. It just turns out that these ones are rather good at dislodging the gram-positive bacteria from the small intestine. Once you've done that for a week or so, a couple of bowls of this carrot soup a day for 4 or 5, 6 days, you can flavor it with whatever you like. Then you're going to be able to eat Zinobiotic without too much of a problem. One other issue is some people will report constipation. The important thing to note is that this prebiotic fiber is completely fermented. It's not insoluble fiber. You need non-digestible fiber as well, cellulose, hemicellulose, even lignans, because they act as bulking agents, and that's also important. Best source of those types of fibers would be green beans, very rich source of cellulose and hemicellulose. So add those to the menu as well, if you like them, of course. And that should help to resolve the constipation issue. Someone else says, this is interesting, someone said, I used to put ZINOBIOTIC in almost everything while cooking. And that's really interesting because these fibers are heat resistant and you can cook with them. You can bake them into bread or biscuits. You can boil them and add them to porridge. You can eat them in almost any format that you want. And I'll typically mix them into yogurt, at some point during the day. But in fact, the fiber blend tastes really pleasant. It has a mild sweetness. And sometimes I just, take the scoop of powder and just chew on that. It's actually not too bad.
Okay, well, we have gotten all kinds of advice here on different things. I don't think we've ever had a call like this one before with different things. We might need to go back and have another call with you, Dr. Paul, in regards to so many questions. But thank you for your time today. I think just let's sum up the things that we've talked about. We talked about getting old, and that what a lot of people are thinking about getting old is not true. We don't need to be getting old in the way that we've heard so many people talking about. The diseases of uncivilization are categorized into these 4 areas that Dr. Paul talked about in regards to the inflammation or being in the inflammatory state, and also in regards to malnutrition or type B, and dysbiosis and this glycemic mismatch. And besides getting out and living on your own and having your own garden, one thing that you could choose to do, which Dr. Paul has been formulating, and I think Dr. Paul is taking himself until now, is the Zinzino health protocol to work on that. And Zinzino is always going to be working on making things better as we go. But Dr. Paul, would you recommend this for everybody? I think there's some people saying different things too.
Well, there are, some areas where you have to be careful. For example, anyone who has had their gallbladder removed, and a lot of people have, or you have biliary dysfunction, then you won't be able to eat significant amounts of fats and oils. And if you then take balance oil, you will have problems. You'll have steatorrhea, diarrhea. It won't be comfortable. But the thing is, what we have, for people who can't absorb and digest oils, that's a problem. Now, it can be caused by gallbladder disease or removal. And for that, we have Aqua X, which is a pre-emulsified form of balance oil. But the absorption problems can also be caused by exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. And we don't really have a way to get around that unless you want to co-ingest the oil with an exogenous lipase. So there is, I think some people I know are doing that, and that seems to work. It's a bit complicated. But the rest of the products, there aren't really any significant contraindications. Not even blood thinners. We used to think that blood thinners were a contraindication for taking fish oil, and now there's a couple of papers which says, well, it just doesn't seem to be a problem when you actually look at it and study it. I would say always be cautious, always be conservative. Anyone working in healthcare should be, but proceed with caution, but with confidence.
So I'm going to have one last question, just because I want to hear your idea of the future of what you're going to do with Zinzino, or what you really want to accomplish with the things that you are creating.
Oh, good Lord. Well, that's always presuming the Americans don't drive us all into an atomic version of World War III.
Okay.
But let's say they don't. Let's say they don't. Let's say that things continue as they are. I think that we're now almost 1 million strong. And what's happening is that the health profile of this particular group is beginning to diverge dramatically from the mainstream. The people who are inside the Zinzino family are looking more and more like a blue zone. Mm-hmm. And the frequency, people are still getting sick, people are still dying, but they're not in the same way that we see in the wider world. So the frequency of these chronic degenerative diseases seems to be falling, and significantly so. At a certain point, as this experiment spreads, we're going to start to see changes in health expectancy and life expectancy in cities and in nations. I think I can tell you that there are people who are talking to me about these types of ideas who are very interested in the idea of genuinely preventive public health. This is an effective and cost-effective, and probably the only way to achieve the improvements in public health that the pharmaceutical industry has signally failed to deliver. But there are one or two politicians around who who are still capable of statesmanship. They're in a minority, a tiny minority, but who genuinely have the welfare of their constituents in mind. And they are interested in programs like this. So they are watching what we're doing, as indeed are the biobankers. I'm hoping this experiment will spread. And I think that if we can achieve this, we will disseminate better health and better well-being for all, for everyone.
Wonderful. Well, we are so appreciative of everything that you are working for, and we are so proud to be a part of that Blue Zone. I know I personally am, Dr. Paul. I thank you for what you've done for me and my family, and I hope all of you got some great information out of today. Thank you all for your questions and your time and for staying with, and I will unmute everybody so that they can also thank you. Dr. Paul, thank you for your time. We appreciate you so much. Thanks, Dr. Paul.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.